Hello, welcome on DM25. We are a radical pan-European political movement. And today we focus on housing problem. So house not a commodity, but a human right. In the frame of an information event we are organizing in Hamburg around this topic. And we have the pleasure to have with us Sarah Gainsforth from Italy, an independent researcher, journalist, and writer specializing on housing policies and urban planning. Sarah, thank you very much for your time and for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
So the aim of this conversation with Sarah is to have an international perspective on the topic. And Sarah is based in Rome, and she knows a lot of data. So I'd like Sarah to start with something very current, let's say, which is the problem of students that are a weak part of the population. So this is an article you wrote recently in September, end of September, and it's published by Il Manifesto. And there is this picture of students outside the university building tents to shape this protest. Can you tell us a little bit about this and how if there are any solutions to the problem that you see?
Yes, yes. Students have been protesting in Italy since last year because they're living a housing crisis caused by the lack of basically student housing. I think it's to give a few numbers, public student housing covers only about 5% of the demand. And so basically they have to rent housing on the private markets. But Italy's private rental market has shrunk over the past years with the growth of home ownership. And this situation has kind of exploded over the past years with touristification, with Airbnb, with short-term rentals, which compete with student housing. And so basically students are not finding any housing anymore, and the prices are just going up and they're too high. Rents are way too high for them. So that's the main reason why they've been protesting. Italy has up until 2020 had only about 40,000 student housing units, public student housing units. So with the National Recovery Plan, with the European funding, the aim was to bring that number to 100,000 student housing units. So this is also one of the reasons why students have been protesting, is because there is basically no oversight on projects funded with public funds. Italy has been subsidizing private, let's say, private providers of student housing, actually since the year 2000. And the only rule basically that was stated in the law was that 20% of these units subsidized with public funding had to be allocated to low-income students. But again, there was no oversight, and so we had no data. The Ministry of University and Education does not publish this data. So the situation was already very unclear before the implementation of the recovery plan, which changed this law, increasing the percentage of public funding given to private providers. So now the state covers like 75% of the total cost for each unit. But again, there's no guarantee that you know, a certain percentage of these new housing units actually go to low-income students. And then one of the other problems that emerged, and which then caused the European Commission actually to block this national recovery measure, is that actually the government was not subsidizing new housing units. It was just simply subsidizing already existing private housing units. And so actually there was not a real increase in student housing units. That's the whole point. And so that's why students are protesting in Italy since last year.
Thank you. I took some data from your book Abitare Stanca, which maybe can be translated with to inhabit gets people tired, to live in houses, basically. And this is a journey through the history of housing policies, and it's really full of data and information. So I just extrapolated something that I think it's relevant to know for people that don't know the Italian situation very well. So maybe more than 60% of people between 18 and 34 years still live with their parents. When it comes to owning the place where you basically live, most of people owning it's richer people, basically. And while there are 7 million of empty houses, and if you are alone in a big city, it's almost impossible to find something to rent. I imagine even more to buy. So can you give us a bit of background about this situation?
Yes, exactly. The situation is what you described. Most young people in Italy live with their parents up until 34, but I mean even later, because the housing market is kind of frozen. There are, you know, a series of factors behind this situation. Salaries are very low in Italy. I mean, they've actually shrunk since 1990. They haven't risen, they've gone down. Housing prices, on the other hand, have risen 5 times since the 80s. So basically, young people simply can't afford to live by themselves. This current economic situation is very different compared to the one their parents were living in when they became homeowners. So Italy, you know, the home ownership has grown over the past 40 years, and so basically, young people find it increasingly hard both to rent and to buy housing in Italy. This is because there are no public policies. The last public policies for housing were implemented in the 90s, and so the only supply of housing basically is private supply, private housing, private rental markets, or buying. The new generations are just cut out of the market. They cannot access the market. So some of them will inherit their home by the family home, but others won't. And so that's also why students have been protesting, because the housing crisis has always been portrayed in Italy as something that is kind of it's marginal. It's only poor people who have this problem, while actually it's most of the new generations who, especially the ones who cannot rely on family wealth, basically.
I see. So you basically replied to some of my next questions, which is great. Maybe can you give us insights in how these problems are approached in the media in Italy, and how in the political debate?
Yeah, but also, yes, I'm glad you asked this question, because one of the main problems is not only, you know, the lack of public policies. It's the cultural you know, environment we're in. So, you know, young people, for example, have, especially in recent years, you know, the more they protest, the more they're called, you know, like lazy, mammoni, which means, you know, so actually they become accused of the problem, you know, they're denouncing as if they were responsible for it. Well, actually, you know, that's the effect of this kind of housing market, and the fact that they cannot access housing. And so this is a very strong narrative in Italy, which is, you know, brought forth by the media, by politicians. Another word, you know, used to describe young people in Italy, which was used by a minister years ago, was choosy. They're too choosy. So, you know, they're spoiled. They don't want to work. They don't want to, you know, be independent. Well, you know, I think this is, you know, finally this narrative may be coming to an end, because young people are starting really to protest because they really have no future the way things are now in Italy.
And how would you characterize the cultural aspects of housing in Italy? In Germany, there is still very much the notion of having to buy a own house or apartment in the long run, maybe less than in Italy. Anyway, if you are not able to do that, it means a little bit like you didn't make it, you know? Do you see cultural peculiarities when looking at how Italy talks about this?
Yes, I think there's this very, very strong cultural home ownership. Basically, is very, very, you know, is a cultural tradition here. But I think it's also important to say that this, you know, home ownership grew, you know, from the 60s. I think it was in the past anyway, you know, after the Second World War, from like 71, I think, till 2001, I think it grew 40%. And so the majority of Italian families became a homeowner. But it's important to note this was also because of public policies. The state subsidized public rental housing, but also housing, you know, meant for you know, for sale through a series of programs, spending, you know, approximately like 1 billion euros per year up until the late 90s. So the rise of home ownership in Italy is also the consequence of public funding. It's not just, you know, hard-working families working and buying homes. Of course, you know, the costs of housing costs were not worth what they are today. Salaries and wages were better. So it's, you know, the combination of things. But I think it's interesting to note that there's, you know, a very high percentage of outright home ownership. It's like 60% of Italian families, you know, who have already paid off the mortgage. So they became, you know, homeowners in the past decades, while families who are still paying a mortgage are actually the minority of the population. It's like 13% of families in Italy. Well, double that number, it's like 20% of families are renting. So, you know, that means that actually people buying today are very, you know, as I said before, that's the minority, because, you know, it's so difficult also to access, you know, a mortgage, to get a mortgage, because of how labor conditions have changed basically, and so many young people don't have, you know, the requirements that are needed to be able to buy a home, and this is causing the housing crisis, because basically the housing legislation is outdated. It's old. It's the last, you know, policies implemented, the last law on housing is, you know, it was approved in 1998. Meanwhile, you know, the economic conditions have changed so much, the labor market has changed so much, and so that's one of the big problems which needs to be dealt with, basically.
Your work of analysis often focuses on Airbnb as a privatized actor who drastically changed the renting and housing landscape in urban areas worldwide, actually. How did you get into this topic, and can you summarize your main critique and observation regarding Airbnb?
Yes, well, actually, because I started basically just noticing the change I live in Rome, and that it was 2017, 16, 17. I was doing work in the center of Rome, in the city center, which has always been touristic. But I noticed this increase in tourism, and I noticed this change. And at the time, there was no data on the spread of Airbnb. So I contacted Murray Cox from inside Airbnb, who, you know, publishes that data on his website. And so we worked on the data for Rome, and we published it, and we analyzed it. And so we started, you know, I started to try and bring the debate about Airbnb that was, you know, ongoing, for example, in the States or in other European cities, where, you know, Airbnb was considered to be a problem regarding housing, whereas in Italy, there was not this kind of awareness, and it was only ever mentioned when dealing with fiscal issues. And so anyway, this is, you know, this has been going on in Italy now, where there's some public debate about it, but actually, I mean, Italy has not yet regulated short-term rentals. It's one of the few countries in the Western world that hasn't dealt with this. And so basically cities, not only, you know, the bigger cities, but also smaller cities in Italy have been radically impacted by the spread of Airbnbs. Also because, as I was saying before, the private rental housing stock is so scarce, and so you know, most, you know, homeowners who own homes in city centers have switched from, you know, renting to long-term tenants to short-term rentals, renting out to tourists. And so this has had an enormous impact in Italy, also on, you know, just the quality of cities, the urban quality. But, you know, unfortunately, we're still far from regulating this phenomena.
And who you think should act to change the situation, not only related to B&B, but about the housing problem in general? Do we need more social movements to address this issue? And do you see the state or politics as an ally, or rather an opponent in the question of affordable houses?
Yes, I think there definitely needs to be a discussion, and legislation needs to be updated. You know, the public administration is, you know, slow compared to what's going on. Like, I'm thinking of, for example, the problem, actually, the issue today is not even short-term rentals anymore, it's mid-term rentals. You know, it's so you know, legislation needs to continually be updated. So this is a big problem. In Italy, I think, we're like way back, because at least other countries, they do have very serious housing crisis, but at least, you can see there is awareness, there regulations are implemented. Whereas in Italy, there's no such thing. And I think, the issue we were talking about before about student housing just shows how the public is not only offering an alternative to the private markets and to private providers, but it's subsidizing them. So it's just facilitating private real estate speculation. That's what's what's so worrying about the current situation in Italy.
Thank you. Reading back this first data we shared before, I think about this aspect that I think is very peculiar for Italy and interesting to know. In 2020, basically 33% of Italian families were constituted by one person alone. And I think if you are alone, it's much difficult to rent, but also to buy something, to find something. And despite this, family politics revolves around the family dimension in a like traditional form. Yeah, what do you think about this?
It's interesting. There's such a, also with the current government in Italy, there's such a strong rhetoric on families, but actually in reality, Italy has Italy is like I think with Portugal, it's the oldest country in Europe, and it's one of the oldest in the world. And the population is declining. There are fewer and fewer births, and so this means there will be more and more single people, single families constituted by just one person. This is especially true, I think, in the south of Italy. So the future perspective is kind of worrying. The housing market, as you said, is what it isn't. So it's virtually impossible for especially young people to be able to live alone. So we have adults sharing and forced to live like in this eternal student condition. So basically, this is one of the problems which will have to be addressed in the future, because this number will increase in the next few years. The number of single people. This is also a problem for people, on public housing waiting lists, because those homes, public housing in Italy was built after the Second World War, when families, were large families with 3-4 kids. Well, the houses are very big, and so single people on a housing, on a waiting list, they never get, they're never allocated public housing, because there are not very many small homes that they can access, basically.
Perfect. Thank you very much again for your time. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you.